What's happening, people? Back with another reaction, back with some more Propagandhi. And this one is actually a request. Shout out to Ryan. Mentioned this song, and I thought, you know what? Not only is that a good song, but I don't think I've listened to it specifically in quite a while. So, be an interesting one to go back to. Sonically, I'm actually sort of having a hard time like hearing it. Like it's one of those things where when you think of the lyrics, you can think of kind of how they're sung. And I do remember it's sort of like, it has a punk rock feel, but I remember it's sort of like emotional. I think some of the guitar work kind of has like an emotional saturation. So sonically, it'll be interesting to go through it because I actually, I'm not remembering it in detail. But lyrically, I remember it a little bit better. As an American who has been for pretty much my entire life since I was old enough to think about these things, very critical of war, and I try to be nonviolent in both my personal life and in the sort of public life, and things that I support and so on. I get it. We live in a real world, but ultimately, I just think that violence doesn't solve problems. It never gets at the root issue. It can prove who has greater might, whether that's physical might or technological might or so on. But at the end of the day, the underlying issue remains, and whatever conflicts or problems that it caused will continue to be caused until it is actually dealt with. So, yeah, violence can work for some people, ambitious and otherwise, but it ultimately is inimical to progress in human relations, whether that is in the short term and on the one-to-one level, or for centuries looking forward as an entire species. So, bottom line, as someone who has long been critical of war and has opposed it both in principle and in practice, this song is a song that certainly resonates with me because it's a song that speaks to the horrors of war. It's a song that speaks to what happens when planes drop indiscriminate bombs like from the sky on populations that are at least in part civilian, and where a certain amount of civilian deaths, innocent people dying in brutally violent ways, a certain level of that is tolerated as sort of collateral damage, is the sort of international euphemism that has come about. This idea that, well, if you get enough of the bad guys, maybe it's not so bad if you get enough of the good guys as well, or if you get some of the good guys as well. And that's where I think the song gets interesting, because it specifically references Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State during Clinton's second administration, or second term, which is to say she was not Secretary of State when the U.S. invaded, or U.S. and the group of governments which basically just went along with what the U.S. was saying and trying to like undercut the authority of the UN and so on, which look what happens when you do that. Is it like, well, eventually other countries start ignoring what the UN is saying and so on. So there's a million things to say about this, but bottom line, she served from 97 to 2001. So by the time of the invasion, by the time of these indiscriminate, Allied planes that are bombing parts of Iraq, in which, the song talks about the human consequences of that, a woman's best friend's, like, brother or something is, like, burning, or I think maybe it's a sister, but basically they can't put out the flames on her body because the bombs continue to fall, and to the point where, they just have to take shelter and so on. An idea that, like, well, she wasn't actually a terrorist, she wasn't in support of Saddam's regime or whatever, she was just a normal citizen, maybe even abused and oppressed by Saddam's regime, which is another point. It's like, there's so many complicated angles when it comes to this issue, but the bottom line is it speaks to the horrors and the human toll of that collateral damage. But it's funny because Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State under Clinton, the Clinton administration, they hadn't gone to war in a military sense against Iraq, but they, were trying to get Saddam out of power, and because of what he had done in the Gulf War in terms of invading Kuwait and so on, they had sanctions heavily placed on the Iraqi regime, and Saddam basically continued to take all the country's resources for him and his cronies and people close to him, and so he essentially passed those sanctions down on to the poorest Iraqis, which led to deaths through starvation, because again, like, the food resources that the country did have, they were sort of going to Saddam's preferred supporters and so on. So people in the like very lowest margins of Iraqi society actually dealt with like severe food shortages and so on, and there were like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we're talking about like thousands of people who died from like malnourishment and so on, including like many children. And Madeleine Albright was on TV one time, and I remember this because by the time I was a late teen, I was already sort of, very politically plugged in and, listened to a lot of punk rock and, very strong opinions about things. And I remember, I forget if it was like 60 Minutes, but someone asked her and they said, the Iraqi regime, they don't really seem to be suffering directly from the sanctions. They seem to have found a way to essentially make lesser Iraqi citizens kind of, deal with the shortages while they continue to get what they need for the, again, the cronies and the high party supporters and so on. And it may have led to thousands of child starvation deaths. Is that like a worthy price to pay for trying to get a certain leader out of power? And she answered almost unflinchingly, yes, we think that is a price worth paying. Which again, it must be convenient to say that when it's not your kid, when it's not your family, like struggling to find enough to just get by to the end of the week. So I remember it like really like struck me sort of in a negative way emotionally, in the sense that like, look, I get it. I mean, even at the time I understood, Saddam Hussein is not a kind fellow, not only in terms of his international like foreign policy, but even in terms of the way he was treating a lot of Iraqis domestically. Including the Kurds, of course. So, again, it's a really complicated issue, but it was the sort of cavalier way in which she was like, oh, we do think that's a price worth paying, again, which, like, we wonder if she would say the same thing if they were innocent American children or even her children and so on, whereas if it's other people who are actually innocent and who are not the people you're trying to target, well, it's like, it's collateral damage, it's a price worth paying. So I think it's kind of getting at two different types of collateral damage, and it's doing it in relation to like two different U.S. administrations in terms of their effect on normal people living 8,000 miles away, which as you get to the end of the song, it talks about how, in the U.S. you have people like statues of people who like decided to, drop bombs on people and kill them. It's like atomic murderers enshrined in Independence USA. Meanwhile, in the cradle of democracy, which if you didn't know, ancient Mesopotamia, of which like modern day Iraq accounts for a large part of that, or encompasses a large part of ancient Mesopotamia, that is the cradle of democracy, which is funny, right? Like the West started in the East. But yeah, ultimately, Mesopotamia, Sumer, and so on, or Akkadia, they were like the first sort of what we would call like modern, in the modern sense of the term, like democracies, or not in the modern sense, precisely not that. They were democracies in a certain respect, but not as we may have come to understand them. But yeah, bottom line, it's a very interesting song that gets at multiple angles of the concept of collateral damage in relation to like U.S. foreign policy, and it makes the point is it's not just the U.S. It's like Britain and other countries went along with it. So it talks about like Allied warplanes dropping bombs that set these bodies on fire that are then not allowed to be put out because of the constant shelling. So this is another one where I'm talking way too long, but we'll get to it. This is Propagandhi. Oh, but that's the whole thing. So the idea is that like, if, once they toppled that statue in the square, which we now know, like, I mean, it was even obvious at the time, but it was supposed to be this, like, oh, look, ordinary Iraqis, they were so happy to get Saddam out that even, like, while experiencing an invasion, they're ready to tear down the Saddam statue. Well, they basically been paid by, like, local battalions of U.S. soldiers who were like, hey, just, can you go do this, and, like, we're going to tape you doing it and whatever. But the idea is if they put up a statue of Madeleine Albright, the people whose families, lost children and so on, because of the, lack of food resources, in part due to the imposition of sanctions, that they would cut off the head of a Madeleine Albright statue as the foundry scrambled to recast the head and put it back on. So, sorry once again for the verbosity, but here we go. This is Albright Monument, Baghdad.
Fucking Just the rest of this year, and I drink myself to sleep 'cause I'm losing faith. That we cannot do anything more.
The cause and a death
Subsidies, a moving poison and death machine. Pretending they complicity, wanting to somebody else to throw. The bodies will change keys. I drink myself to sleep because I'm losing faith that way. We're in the grave. Afterwards just cease.
The cradle of afterlife.
Individual strength through state power swinging fists that will only back you up. The irony that is atomic murderers enshrine Independence USA 1,000 miles from here in the cradle of democracy. It's another better year. I wish you all the Connor, George and Constantine. I started scrolling to recount. He's decapitated my mind.
His decapitated monument, though. I think they did say his decapitated monument, so yeah, I'm not sure. Do let me know, again, if there's someone else named Albright. I feel like, given the context of the way that, she sort of famously talked about sanctions on Iraq and so on, it makes me wonder, is there someone else named Albright who has a direct connection to U.S. foreign policy and the consequences for Iraqi citizens? Because I swear he said his, which, like I said, I hadn't listened to this song in a while. And I think I remembered it as being as Foundry scrambled to recast her decapitated monument. But yeah, if there's someone else named Albright who checks all those boxes, do let me know. But maybe I'm just understanding the monument part of it wrong, but that the Albright in question still is Madeleine Albright. But yeah, shout out to Ryan. I really do enjoy this album. I say that about all Propagandhi albums, but I mean it in different ways, right? Like I mentioned before, How to Clean Everything, it's it changed my life, and I love this sound, which I had heard a little punk rock up until that point, but it was a very fresh sound, and it was the first real kind of dissident punk rock that I had ever heard. So that was sort of life-changing, and then their second album made me grow as a listener of punk rock in terms of it wasn't exactly what I expected, and there were some songs that I wasn't able to penetrate the lyrics as easily. I just reacted to Anchorless, and that one, like I said, at the time it was it's kind of a weird song, and I might skip past it, and also it seems like when the other singer, John K. Samson, the bassist, sings, he sings about more kind of personal stuff. Well, that was, I was only glancing by the track, and I didn't realize quite what I was dealing with, and I've come to really enjoy that track, which I realized, while doing that reaction, that I actually really love it more than I remembered. But yeah, it's, like I said, it's interesting, because there are tunes that, when I heard them originally, maybe they didn't stand out to me as much as others. This, I think, would be an example. I love this album. I mentioned it before. It's the first appearance of Todd in the group, and you can hear their sound begin to change, even though it's very similar in some ways to Less Talk, More Rock. But yeah, this song I didn't remember, but I think sonically it was close to what I was speculating. I think it was, it's a fast kind of punk rock tune, but some of the guitar work and some of the sort of interludes, they feel a bit more kind of melodic punk rock. So yeah, it was a really cool tune. Do let me know if you have an angle on the statue itself, or maybe a layer of the lyrics that I'm not remembering right, or that I didn't sort of pick up on in the listen. But yeah, other than that, thank you for listening and watching. I will see you next time. Peace.